Hey, welcome, my friends, back to another fine episode of DEFCON 5, a series I put together on the City of Heroes Homecoming servers, the Excelsior Shard, taking a look at various combinations, head-to-head comparisons of some defenders and controllers. And at level DEFCON 3, we had time manipulation, where I was taking a look at my time dual pistols ice mastery defender by the name of Marquis du Temps and comparing him over a set of 5 missions with my controller Bhootakash, who is gravity, time, and energy mastery. And I crunched the numbers for both of these characters. I went ahead and posted the videos of that analysis, shared all the team testing, shared the build, shared the solo run, etc., etc. I gave pretty much everything that I have out there for you guys. But today we're gonna wrap this up. We're gonna come to a conclusion. We're gonna take a look at these two characters head to head, mano a mano, trying to figure out which one is better, who is the superior supporter. And in the doing, we're going to try to get this data from 5 different pairs of controllers and defenders so that we can answer the ultimate question by compiling all this data as to which archetype is superior, which one is the one you want to pick for your team. So let's go ahead and dive into the head-to-head on these two. All right, here we go. I want to swap over to full screen mode. Alrighty, here we are, my friends. We've got Marquis, the defender, in blue, and we've got Bhootakash, the controller, in red. Let's do a breakdown of the missions themselves. Both of these characters ran 5 missions. Marquis, his missions were all with a team of 5, with the exception of the very last one, which started with a team of 5, but one of the characters dropped out right after we finished the safeguard bank portion of that mission, and did not stick around for the bulk of the mission, which was all the side action. So I ultimately said that was just a 3 teammate group there. Meanwhile, Bhootakash, 5 missions as well. Had 4 teammates in all those, so there was no deviation from the original plan. And then the big thing you're seeing here is the grand total of time that was spent. 72 minutes for my defender, so a little bit over an hour for those 5 missions. And meanwhile, Bhootakash over here was over 2 stinking hours of time, 131 minutes. So that was an extra 60 minutes approximately over here. That's going to become a very important stat that's going to factor in the rest of this comparison here. But we had pretty standard fare, right? We're fighting Nemesis, we're fighting Arachnos, Devouring Earth, 5th column, and we end with the Safeguard mission, Peregrine Isle. And then over on Bhutakash's side, we had Arachnos, Carnies, 5th column, Council, and the same Safeguard mission here. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the stats. Now, I've shown each of these individually with the analysis of the team action for both characters, so I'm not going to spend a terrible amount of time on that stuff again, but just kind of show these two head to head so you can get a much better idea of what we're looking at here. So survivability was the first category of stats that I'm going to show here, and that's the number of defeats that the character themselves suffered. And looking at the head-to-head, you can see it was pretty close. My defender had no defeats at all in these 72 minutes, and my controller had a single defeat in 131 minutes. So both were extremely survivable characters in these trials, in these tests. If we go ahead and then take a look at our next stat, where we're taking a look at the risk, this would be the number of defeats that your allies would have suffered. And this is a measure of how supportive your character is. If your allies are dying left, right, and center, well, then that suggests you're not doing a very good job. So taking a look at the numbers, we had 4 allies defeated on the defender side and 9, so twice as many over here with my controller. And, on the surface, that seems like, ooh, the controller wasn't as good at protecting. But again, remember, this set of missions lasted almost twice as long. So if you kind of do the math and look at the rates here, the risk rate, that's the amount of defeats per minute, we're at oh 05 versus oh 07. So pretty close. We'll take a look at what that means in a head-to-head statistics, but overall, pretty solid. Wasn't anything crazy or scary. The index that you're seeing here, this is the per teammate defeat. And so the numbers were also pretty close, 0.25 versus 0.45. This team over here was always a consistent four teammates. Okay, four teammates. Where the defender was four for just about everything. Again, except for that very last mission, was only three teammates. So all we're doing here for the risk, we're taking these defeats and dividing by the time for the rate, and then we're taking the defeats and dividing it by the number of teammates to get our indices over here. But numbers are pretty close, and I think head-to-head wise, you're not going to see much difference there, just given that this character was on her missions for twice as long. Your next stat you're looking at is lethality. This is how many foes the characters defeated. Some measure of offensive output, although not raw offense, because the defeats are only whatever damage was enough to finish that foe. So it could have just been getting lucky and landing the final blow. Taking a look at the head-to-head side-by-side here, we got 279 total versus 369. So again, this looks like a pretty dramatic difference. We have almost 100 extra, about 90 additional over on the controller side. But again, we have to factor in time. It was a lot longer time. So when you do that and you look at the rates, it's 4 per minute versus 2.8, almost 3. So the defender was actually defeating more foes per minute than the controller was. The per teammate difference was seemingly minimal. And remember what we're going to do here. We're not just going to look at these numbers like I'm verbally saying here. We're actually going to do some stats and answer the question, hey, is 4 versus 2.8 or 2.9, is that a significant difference statistically speaking? So we can look at this and say, oh yeah, the defender was better, did more defeats per minute. But statistically, is there a huge difference there, yes or no? Then we're going to take a look also at the threat level of each of these characters, and that is just your raw damage. This is a better measurement of your straight up firepower offensive abilities that your character has. And again, the numbers seem pretty similar, and this is actually a little bit indicative of where I think we're going to see the big difference, because at the surface, we add up everything. The defender, all by their lonesome, did about 232K. Your controller did about 236,000. So this was only about 4 or 5,000 more over here. And while it's more, remember, this is with an extra hour's worth of time. So the damage output, even though it looks comparable on paper, I think you're going to see that the defender's numbers per minute were much higher, at least the raw defender numbers. Where the controller makes up a lot of ground is in the pet category. So let's take a look at that real quick. Our pet damage output, scroll that down. Your controller over here is putting out 171,000 total damage versus the 57 that you're seeing over here, 58. So, here again, we have another huge difference, about 100 and what, 113,000 total, if my math is right. 113 plus 57. Yeah, that's a huge advantage on the controller side. But again, we have to factor in that this is an extra 60 minutes. So is it that big of a difference? It's clearly a difference, but how big of a difference? And when we factor in the total damages, because the defender themselves had actually out-damaged, we're looking at a combined total of 289 about 290,000 versus 407. So your control over here, again, on paper, just looking at the raw numbers, is out damaging. But when we go and bake this down to the rates, the per minute rates, you could see your defenders actually per minute putting out about an extra 1,000 damage. So I think when we look at the stats on this, I think we might be looking for this area as the statistically significant difference between these two characters. But we'll have to go and check that out in a minute. All right, what else we have to take a look at? All right, I do want to roll back and just take a look at any specific types of damage. That is something interesting between the two. So if we take a look at Marquis damage over here on the left in blue and Bhootakash on the right in red, you can see where a lot of sort of the side-by-side comparisons are. So I kind of want to look at, for instance, your judgment abilities. So if you look at my defender here, he's got 67 and 8,000 from his combined judgments. He's got a combined 75,000 or something like that. Now, the difference between the judgments, is I can tell, is that the smaller number, the 8,000, I'm pretty sure is the direct damage, so the primary target that you hit, and then I'm pretty sure the 67,000 is all the jumps that the power does, or vice versa. But I'm pretty sure that's the difference between the two. So between those two, his judgment was hitting 75k. Her judgment, which was cryonic radial, did about 70,000. So head-to-head comparison. I think that's again, the numbers are pretty close. But again, we have to look and say, hey, this character was out there for 60 extra minutes. So I wasn't aware that judgment might be affected by AT level modifiers. I don't think that it is. So this is a little bit interesting that cryonic was much less damage. I know ionic is one of your big damagers, but this seems to me to be a little bit extreme, because if I were to extrapolate this out per minute, I'm pushing probably 130, 140k if I ran for about the same length of mission time. So that'd be like double what the cryonic's putting out. This guy was built more for damage, so that's possible. He also had the double hit with the assault, so that might trigger in with ionic a bit. I'm not 100% sure on that one. Whereas Bhootakash over here, she was much more controlling and defensive minded. So it's a little bit surprising that that set of incarnate judgment powers did that much more. I don't know if that's normal or not. Maybe if I'd slotted her more on the assault side of things, I could have equaled out. But that's one big difference I see sort of popping out at me. The rest of these things, we kind of just look at sort of best damaging powers. We've got Bullet Rain, which is one of the AoEs. We've got Empty Clips, there's another AoE. Hail of Bullets, AoE. Piercing Rounds is the other AoE. So there are 4 cone or PB AoE, targeted AoE powers here. Over here we have Crushing Field is your cone AoE. Energy Torrent is your other cone AoE. And then the rest of these are just single target damages. Crushing Field is spiked with a lot of procs. So overall, I got 13, 18, 22, 32, about 37,000 total with Crushing Field and its procs. So that's, pretty comparable to what I was getting with Empty Clips is the cone attack for dual pistols. So, this is I think Crushing Field, I don't think it's a cone, I think it's an AoE. But it looks like it'd be on par with, I think Bullet Rain is your targeted AoE, if I'm not mistaken, or else it's Hail of Bullets. I forget which one is the PBOE, which one's the AoE. But anyway, this controller only has really one major AoE power. That's your Crushing Field. Energy Torrent's not doing too bad. So between these two, you're roughly equaling, 2 of these 4. So that means your defender's got the advantage with a couple other of these powers here. But notice this is pretty, spectacular. Like single target lift is putting out 23,000. Single target propel, it has a splash knockback, but it's the damage is single target. Those are putting out a lot of damage. And so again, it looks like when you're looking at this, go, whoa, these single target powers are out damaging your AoEs and cones over here. We still have to again remember this is an extra 60 minutes on this side. So if I were to come over here and roughly double these numbers, you're going to see much more comparable. But I do think it's interesting that, we're looking at 32, 23. So even if I went and doubled, let's say, piercing rounds, which is your narrow cone you have in dual pistols, that thing's only going to push about 27k if I were to double the damage. So that's on par with these single target attacks that Gravity's putting out. Gravity does get bonus damage, I think, with both lift and propel when you use it against held targets, targets that you're holding with gravity distortion. So those two do amplify each other. Plus, you have containment is going to give you extra damage. So, some of these powers are pretty strong the way they're slotted and the way that, the controller's able to take advantage of them. But the defender just has more raw attacks. So the defender is going to be able to put out more damage overall with their specific, primary, secondary power set. The big difference is, again, the pet side of things. So when you look at the pets, I have the ice elemental plus my two lore pets over here. So they put in a decent chunk of damage, but it wasn't as nearly as much as what your controller's putting out. Your controller has the lore pets as well. So if you kind of look lore to lore, we've got 25-ish, what's this, 30, about 40,000 total damage from the lore pets versus the two storm elementals is putting out like 92,000 total. But again, an extra 60 minutes, so we cut this roughly in half or roughly double this. You can see that, yeah, the lore pets were about comparable in damage output overall, so not too shabby. But the big difference here, of course, is you've got Ice Elemental versus your Singularity. Singularity, hands down, is out damaging your Ice Elemental. Ice Elemental, I think, has just 2 attacks, where Singularity has 3 or 4. So it's much more spammy with its attack chain. And even if I were to double this number to get up roughly to the same amount of time, we're looking at about 35,000 total damage. This guy's still, Singularity, still out damaging by about 30k. So that's a huge amount of damage output. And so this is what I keep seeing, that if you can get a defender with pets, they can easily match or out damage your controller, because the defender themselves, just their raw damage is going to be higher because they have more AoEs, they have more damaging attacks. Where the controllers catch up and can surpass is on the pet output. So if you're trying to make your defender more damagey, I think you got to lean into getting pets. And there are a couple sets out there now on the patron side, the villain side. All those patron pools, they have pets. So there's 4 options there. And then you have an option for a pet getting it from Ice Mastery, which is what I did with Ice Elemental. So there's that one. You have your lore pets, of course. Everybody can get those. And then the other area to look would be in your primary and secondary. So primary wise, Dark Miasma has a pet. And then secondary wise, Electrical Blast would have Voltaic Sentinel as a pet. And I've seen with my Emperor Avenger that I ran in DEFCON 5 that Voltaic Sentinel actually put out a really strong chunk of damage. So I think, as I'm looking at this, if I were to try to build a really damagey defender, aside from, slotting your main attacks, I think if you went Dark, Electric, Ice, or something like that, or Dark, Electric, Patron, plus your lore pets, that would give you access to 5 pets, which would put you in controller territory as far as, pet output damage. And then you're going to have the improved damage output from your much more expansive attack chain than the controllers can muster. All right, let's get to the last couple stats I want to look at side by side. We've got our resilience category, which is your damage taken. So the first table here is showing you the damage by type. And just looking at the totals here, we got 267 versus 40. Is that 47? Should be sorry, 267. 27 like 267,000 versus 47. No, it wasn't that crazy. So your defender took a total of about 27K. And your controller took about 47, 48K. Again, hey, wow, the controller took a beating, but they've got an extra 60 minutes. So you got to look at the per minute. We got 359 and 367. Those numbers are almost identical. So I don't think we're going to see a statistical difference between those at all. The other area to take a look would just be at the types of damage you're taking. I'm fighting a variety of foes, so I'm going to be faced with a variety of damage. But, a couple things have stood out to me so far is that, cold damage is very rare in the stuff that I've been fighting. I only take maybe a few hundred of that on average. Negative is pretty obscure as well, although in this one instance here, that controller did take a few thousand of it. But those are kind of your two like rarest. So if you're trying to build around damage resistance, you have to find an area to sacrifice. I think cold and negative are the areas you could sacrifice. Or it also might help you decide what sort of epic, sets you want to take, what sort of shields you want to take. Because some of them have negative, and some of them have cold as their focus. And those are just such rare damage outputs, at least in the upper end game. But other than that, I mean, the only ones that are going to kind of pop out, you took 18K of Psi over here. The big damage type over here really wasn't any lethal, would have been the highest, but pretty consistent for your defender over here. Your controller was much more variable, ranging from a couple thousand up to 18,000. Probably your defender is, I think he was relying more on defense as a mitigation strategy, where she was more, I think, just resistance and controls. So if you're relying upon defense, you're not getting hit. I can see that leading to a more consistent damage input as opposed to resistance, where you're only resistant to a couple of things. She specifically was very resistant to smash lethal. I'm pretty sure she's capped to that. So your smash lethal, I would expect to be some of my lower numbers, 4,000 here, 2,000. So a total of 6,000 smash lethal. And, compare that to my defender. I had a couple thousand here. And lethal was, 7,000. So we're looking about 10K over here for a couple of those big attack types. She's only taking about 6K, and that's with the extra 60 minutes. So that's a pretty significant, difference. So if you are trying to build around smash lethal, which is, what the two most popular damages in the game, that makes sense to do that. And it seems like it pays off for her. She didn't take a whopping ton of damage, even though her defenses aren't as good as the defenders. And then the last thing I think is just looking at is there any specific missions that really, went crazy over the top that, gave you some outlying data? Nothing out of the ordinary, I think, on the defender side. Both of them had safeguards as the longest mission and produced the most incoming damage. You had a really low one here in mission 3, which was, gosh, which one was that? Let me go double check. Mission 3, that was that was that really kind of quick Devouring Earth mission, which was a little bit surprising. I thought it was going to be longer. But anyway, those are, couple, I don't want to say weirdo missions, but nothing insane for that one. Let me scroll down a little bit more here. Is what it is. Wasn't terrible. But then on the controller side, similar. We didn't have any really crazy stuff. The only one that was kind of pops out to me is that first mission, almost 12,000, 11,500. That was pretty high. But I remember that was sort of a shaky start to that team. If you haven't seen that, those team trial missions, go ahead and watch that video when you get a chance. You'll see what I'm talking about. So that one was just a lot of incoming damage from Arachnos, and the team was pretty shaky. There wasn't any one person sort of taking alpha charge of things, and I was doing a lot of wormholing in that one. But that was the main thing that I'm seeing here. So those were the individual stats and things. Let's go ahead and take a look at anything else that popped out that I had mentioned in the team video analysis. I mean, overall, it seemed to me that time manipulation was a very strong protective set. Just kind of like looking at the overall numbers here, because I'm comparing side by side. Let's kind of just focus on the rates and not the indices. They're more indicative of what happened. Survivability wise, for the defender here, you had the fewest defeats. Time manipulation produced the fewest ally defeats per minute. It produced the highest lethality, the number of foes defeated per minute. It produced the highest damage output per minute, and it produced the lowest incoming damage per minute. Now, some of these numbers are not statistically significant, like where the bars overlap. So, for you non statistician folks out there, when you're looking at these bar graphs, we're looking at the height of the bar is the average. That's the 367, the 446, the 729. That's the average per minute number. And then the error bars is what you really want to focus on, because the error bars, if they overlap with a comparison, then there is essentially no difference between them. So even though the averages are different, the error bar tells you that there's a potential float. The average could be anywhere in here based upon the data. So with that in mind, there is no statistically significant difference between at least nature and time. Electric seemed to be the outlier in that particular case there, but unless time is outshining the other two, and ultimately I'll have two more sets to really compare it to. It looks like it's got potential, but like here, it was clearly the most lethal. Now, was it just time, or was it the dual pistols time combo? And also, I built this defender more as an offensive player versus, or character, versus the other two were much more protective and defensive. So I'm not shocked that Marquis out damaged and out defeated enemies compared to the other two. But what I can then look at is the controller side. Do I see similar stats? Nature did better, had no defeats. Nature did better for the controller, had fewest ally defeats for that one. Lethality was best with the nature. The threat rate was highest with the nature, and resilience, the damage in, was lowest. So for a controller, nature produced the best overall stats. Again, not all of these are statistically significant, but some of them are. So is nature better for controllers and is time better for defenders? That's a huge statement that I can't answer without testing way more combinations of nature controllers versus additional combinations of electrical and time, or whatever else. Right now, that was just the combination of Dark Control, which was super powerful, with Nature Affinity. So it might be more the Dark Control that made this happen. And the same idea over here could be more just the Defender was the dual pistols was the difference. But that is, what we're seeing here. There's some interesting data starting to pop out, starting to make things look interesting. The last stat I haven't mentioned yet is just the liability. This is that ratio between input damage and output. So the higher the bar, the higher the average, the more output damage versus input. So for the defender, Marquis again had the biggest ratio of out to in, close to 19 times output damage versus input. And same kind of story over here on the controller, except it was with Nature Affinity 23 times. So, your most potent controller, 23, your most potent defender so far, 19. That's pretty close between them. What I'm going to end up doing at the end of the day is I'm going to have, the other two bars from the other two sets, and then I'm going to get a cumulative average bar for all five. And I'm going to do the same thing over here on the controller side. And that is ultimately the comparison I want to do. These five averaged for all the stats, and then compare them AT versus AT, def versus con. Who is showing you the superior numbers, if any. I don't know yet. All right, so let's get into the final part of this, and that is going to be our much more statistical, fun discussions, the mathy part of the program. All right, so here is the overview of the two characters, which I just went through. The stats we're going to take a look at are these. You're going to see, sums where we're adding things up. We already saw a lot of that data. You're going to see means, the averages, which I've already talked about that a bunch. I already mentioned the rates. That's the per minute stat. And then we're going to compare those with correlation studies to see if there's any direct relationship as time increases. So as we increase time of emission, does this stat, whatever it is, also increase, decrease, or whatever? We're going to get those data points. We're going to draw lines of best fit, and we're going to run a correlation analysis on that slope. And we're looking for correlation that is equal to or greater than a 0.9, somewhere in there, to determine whether or not there is a relationship. So we're looking at that stat. Is there a relationship? Does time have an impact on that statistic? Yes or no? The other thing we're going to look at, and this is I've mentioned this a couple times, but I've done it this time around. We're going to look at the composite data, because the other stat I've been looking at, index, has been statistic, whatever I'm measuring, divided by number of teammates. And that has been giving me my index. The problem is, I don't necessarily know it's a problem, but the idea was that I was always going to have 4 teammates. So I'm always dividing that stat, whatever it is, by 4. So I should get consistent data if all other variables are equal, which of course they're not. But we're looking for this consistency. And we were looking at it through these distribution box and whisker plots, where we were saying, hey, the wider the spread, the less consistent the data is. And then the outliers are shown by these bars, these error bars. Not really error bars, they're just your distribution is anywhere between the top number and the bottom number, with the bulk of your data sitting in the box here. These would be like your outliers. And so we're looking at these and asking the question, hey, is there any sort of difference between the two different controller or defender? The problem is I'm not sure how useful that is if one character has an inconsistent based upon team number or not team number. So we have kind of two things. We have the potential the teams are equal to each other, and we're expecting consistency, and maybe we don't see consistency. Then we could say something like, "Hey, that guy, regardless of team, with the same number of teammates, always got the same stat." Whereas the other guy, he had consistent team size and got variable stats. So if you saw data like that, that kind of apples versus apples comparison, and you saw consistency versus inconsistency, then that would argue, oh, the person that's consistent is able to do the same exact thing every, mission. It's a direct kind of tie-in to the number of teammates, perhaps. Whereas one that's inconsistent is going to have up numbers, down numbers, and so they're less dependent on their teammates as a variable. However, the problem was is I didn't always have 4 of each. I had 3, I had 5 for a couple teammates. And so that then is going to ultimately lead to potential inconsistency, because I have more numbers, a bigger denominator, a smaller denominator when I'm doing the division here. So that could lead to inconsistency. But then if it doesn't lead to inconsistency and it's actually consistent, does that mean anything or not? So that was kind of a big question. Like, what the hell does that even mean? So what I'm decided to do instead was actually do a double standardization for the data. And so what I'm doing is a composite. Hey, what's a composite? It's the same idea as what I was just talking about, except I'm taking the rate and dividing that by the number of teammates. So I'm taking the rate divided by teammate and calling that a composite. Now, hey, what's the benefit of this? So similar concept. The rate is the per minute output that my character's doing. So regardless of what else is going on, there's a certain amount of stat that needs to be done to finish a mission. And then divided by the amount of time that mission takes tells me, how much output or whatever I'm doing or how much input I'm taking over that unit of time. If I then take that stat and divide it by the teammate number, that is going to give me a tighter potential grouping of the data. So I'm looking at a per minute stat per teammate rather than a total stat per teammate. So we're taking a known rate that we've already calculated, and so we know what that number looks like, and then we compare that to the number of teammates and see if that makes any difference. This is going to help us control for the overall variable variance in the mission, because one thing is, as the teammate number changes, 3, 4, 5, that could also change the time, because now I've got more firepower or I have less firepower. I would imagine that's going to change time on top of everything else. But if I've already standardized for time with the rate, and then I divide by the number of teammates, if that's a variable, then that stat would be more tight or more controlled, I guess, as a comparison. So I'm going to be looking at that. I'm going to be doing the same distribution box and whisker plots for those, but I'm just doing a double division on that one. And then, of course, we're going to do the defender versus controller standard error, which you kind of saw a little bit of that already. And we're going to be looking for, is there any significant differences between our average stats between our two characters? And we're looking at those error bars. So we're going to take a look at that. We looked at this in the intra defender and intra controller stats between the different power sets, but I want to look at it in the two different ATs and see. All right, that's enough babbling about stats. Let's actually look at the numbers and see if this makes any damn sense or not. All right, so we have our survivability numbers, which you've seen already. And so there's not a lot to see here because, I have like no deaths for the defender, so that's really hard to compare to 0. But one thing that we, can at least see a little bit here is that, there's no correlation between the controller, or the defender that we can tell. So right now, not super duper crazy useful data aside from, hey, the defender didn't die and the controller died once. All right, let's take a look at the risk, the team safety. Now this one, we're starting to get a little bit more information. So if we take a look at the correlations, we're plotting those 5 missions and we're plotting the time. So, from 0 to whatever, 60 minutes, whatever the case was. And we're then dividing that by the number of the allied defeats by that number. We're getting these data points here, right? So we're seeing all these little dots is the number of allied defeats, and then the time here is over on your x-axis. We then do our lines of best fit, and we get correlations of 6.6 and 7.5. Neither one of these is that 90 cutoff, so neither one of these is showing a direct correlation between the length of time and the number of defeats of my allies. So it's too variable to really say anything about. Doesn't seem to matter too much. Then we've got the composite distribution. So this is the new thing I'm showing you here. So for the defender, we've got most of the data in these box and whiskers is contained within this square part, this rectangle. That's the interquartile range. That's representing the bulk of your data, 50%. And then the stuff that's in the outlier region, above and below this little I-beam looking thing, that's the other 25 and 25%. And then you've got your X is your that's your mean, that's your average, and the line is the median, the middle number. All right, so the average is always going to be in the middle of the box. The median can float up and down depending on if there's outliers or crazy numbers like that. So just looking at that, kind of comparing these side by side, what are we looking for? Similar to what we were looking for with the error bars over here. Is there overlap or not? Right now, yeah, there's overlap, right? The bulk of the data for the defender includes the same bulk of the data for the controller. So there is no dramatic thing. Like if the controller was up here, that would give us an indication that there is some sort of statistical difference between them. The other thing we can look at here is that there are no extreme outliers. So it wasn't like one mission that was, oh my God, 50 people died on it, and that like skews the data. So tight data, it's overlapping, really no statistical significance that we can tell on that. Then we've got ourselves our risk here. 1 second, I want to see if I can get, it looks like I'm washed out my lines. Give me 1 second to fix that. There we go. I had my contrast punched up too high. We're losing all the little lines in the graph. All right, then the last stat you're seeing here, this is the rates. So we're looking at the average rate of Allied defeats per minute, 05 versus 07. That's what the top of these bars represents. And then we have our error bars plotted here. And we're looking for overlap. And sure enough, they're overlapping. So there's no difference here that you can statistically point at. So we can't sit there and go, oh, that 07, that's so terrible. The controller sucks. Can't say that at all. So at this point, the personal defeats and the allied defeats, there's no difference between these two characters as far as the stats show. They're the same. Then we go on to our next one, lethality. This is your body count, how many foes that you have defeated. Here we start to see some daylight between these two. So the defender, when we look for correlation, we're close. So as the length of the mission increases, the number of foes defeated also increases, but it's not statistically significant. The controller's less so. So it doesn't seem like there's really much rhyme or reason to foe defeats for your controller. Where we do start to see some differences, though, is if you start to look here at the lethality composite. So again, this is the rate, number of foes defeated per minute, divided by the number of teammates, which for the controller was I'm always dividing by 4. For the defender, I was dividing by 4 for everything but one of them. The last mission, I was dividing by 3. And, there's some overlap, but there's also a degree of not overlap. And we also do see a little bit of, outlying data here. So we're starting to see some daylight between these two characters, but there's not enough here for you to go, oh my God, that's huge, right? So my controller overall was doing less damage per minute per teammate than my defender was, but it's not extreme enough for us to say, oh yeah. But where you do see some daylight is over here in just the straight up rate. If we take a look at the average rate of defeats, about 4 per minute for my defender, that's up here, versus, about 3 per minute for the controller. And then we look at the error bars, you can see there is daylight between these two. So what that means is your defender is statistically more lethal than the controller with this combination of powers. So hey, more offensive. But lethality is, a weak type of offensive stat because it just means you got the killing blow. You could have done almost no damage, but did the last point and you got the kill. So it's not the greatest of comparisons, but it can at least insinuate that you're in the action. You are doing stuff rather than just hiding in the back somewhere and super busy just healing, right? You're actually attacking. All right, so then our next stat, where we're going to see some more interesting data. This is your threat. This is your damage output. And on the defender side, we see correlation. So we have what I would call correlation. We have more than 90%. So as the length of the mission went up, yes, the defender is putting out more damage. That is to be expected. I would hypothesize that for everybody. But what's interesting is I don't think I've seen that yet for a controller. I have to double check those numbers, but I don't think any of my controllers has shown correlation between mission length and damage output. So that's a little weird because you would think, hey, as the mission goes on, shouldn't you be doing more damage? I would think, but not true. So I don't know. It's strange why that is. I can't give you a good explanation for it. The other thing, if we look at just the rates, the average rates, 4,100 versus 3,100, and then we do the stats on this one, again, we're seeing some daylight. It's not huge, but it's there. So our defender, yes, is a greater threat statistically than our controller. So my time defender is defeating more foes statistically and doing more damage statistically than my controller was. So that build is a more offensive build than the controller was. That's what this data is showing us. And when we take that number and divide it by the teammates, again, we're seeing similar, not enough difference yet, but similar numbers here. And the other thing I am consistently seeing is there is a wider spread of numbers for my defender than my controller. So exactly what does that mean that the average amount of a stat you do is more variable with a defender than it is with a controller? The controller's more consistent play. You're doing roughly the same thing. Maybe that's what it means. The defenders are more variable, flexible with enemies. Um, you know, that could be, they're more responsive perhaps to changing conditions where controllers are just more, they do their thing and they do their thing all the time. Because maybe control is that, because maybe this is the answer, because control is very black and white, right? You're either holding something or you're not. So you're either not taking damage from something that's held or you are taking damage. You have it controlled and are doing containment, or you don't have it controlled and are not doing containment. Where defenders, it's much more variable. You've got different enemy types that might be resistant to your damage that you're putting out. You might need to buff more or heal more or whatever versus certain foes. That's, you have to spend more time in support mode than attack mode. So maybe just this is showing that that play style defender is more variable. You have to be more on your toes where, controllers are more linear, more black and white. Could be. The other thing that is pretty clear is the pet contributions for controllers is just huge. If we look at the two side by side stacked here, the blue is your pet damage output, the orange is the character's damage output. So this is total damage. So I'm not looking at rates. I'm just looking at total damage here. We know that total damage for the controller was greater, but they did spend the extra 60 minutes. So I'm really not worried about that. I'm more just interested in the side-by-side percentages. If you just look at this, you can tell, the controller, the defender was, I don't know, like 20% of their damage was from the pets or something like that. Where my controllers are consistently pretty damn close to 50-50. This one's about 40. But my other controllers, the dark controller had, I think it was like 50-50 or 60-40 for the pets. So consistently, I'm getting, probably an average 45% of the controller's total damage is coming from their pets. Seeing that over and over again. So that's, something to pay attention to, because if you have a controller that doesn't have pets, so let's say I did a test where instead of using gravity time, I used mind control time, I would have lost a ton of this pet damage. And would the confusion of, mind control have made up for all that pet damage? I don't know. That's something definitely to think about if you're trying to run any of these tests, or you're trying to say, hey, you're doing a bunch of damage, or hey, you do crap for damage. Your pets are a huge part of that. All right, then our last side-by-side stat here is the resilience for these two characters. So again, look for correlations. We don't see any. So really the only correlation we've seen so far is with our defender, and that is in the threat. I don't think anywhere else it was close with lethality, but not 90%. So that's the only correlation I've seen, and that's pretty consistent. I'm seeing correlation for threat, that's your damage output, seems to be with defenders only, and I don't see correlation much anywhere else with any other stat or either archetype. So same thing here with the damage resilience, right? There's really no direct correlation here. You would anticipate the longer the mission went, the more damage you take, but I'm not seeing that statistically at this time. Here we're seeing the biggest kind of weird difference between characters as far as the composite goes. So when we look at the average damage in that these characters are taking per minute divided by the number of teammates on the squad, The controller, again, very tight, very consistent numbers. So this controller is taking the same amount of damage per minute per teammate. So it doesn't seem to be variable, right? It seems to be that, this is where it'd be interesting if you were to try to do the studies to then do this comparison versus a team designed to have only three. So like I had consistent four. If I then wanted to do a team with, only three teammates, only two teammates, something like that, and see if this number changes. Does the controller have to do more or do less? Does this get more variable? And speaking of variable, again, our defenders shown more variation in their numbers. Their numbers are distributed wider. I'm really starting to suspect that might be just, I don't want to say play style, but just the way the archetype. I'm wondering, and I don't know if I can any way to kind of prove this or get data that would support this is black and white, controller stuff versus variable defender. I think just on any given team and against any given foe, if I'm a controller, my control job is pretty black and white, right? I stun stuff, I hold stuff, I fear stuff, I immobilize it, whatever. It doesn't matter what the enemy's resistances are or defenses are, really. Whereas damage or buffing directly is going to be highly variable. If, let's say, my character does a bunch of lethal damage, but the enemy I have has a bunch of lethal resistance, my damage numbers are going to be much lower on that mission. Whereas if I, was using, let's say, psi damage and I'm fighting against psi, weak enemies like ghosts, all of a sudden that mission I'm doing a ton of damage. So I can see that being more variable than the control, yes, no. So I'm wondering if that's what we're seeing here. That could be what we're seeing. So, kind of future thinking about this could be a good way to measure either archetype, not necessarily to compare them head to head, but more of the experiential type of comparison. Hey, do you want a variable, wild ride, type of thing? Well, then defender. You want more consistent, lunchbox type of thing, 9 to 5 punch in a clock? Well, that's your controller options. And then you could look within those archetypes themselves and see which one, because that'd be something else I wouldn't. I think I should go back and look at now is look at this stat for the things I've looked at: electric versus nature versus time. You know, are we seeing really tight consistencies with these composites for them versus, the defenders? And is there any one particular, power set combo that is less, tight for the controller or wider for the defender? That would be an interesting look. And then the last comparison stat here is the one that I was already predicting was going to give us this. We have very consistent numbers. The average damage input 367 versus 359. We take a look at the error bars, and yeah, I mean they're on top of each other. So there's no statistically significant difference between these two as far as damage input goes. So that's also consistent. And then we scoot down here to our liability. This is the damage in versus damage out numbers. Correlations again. Is there any correlation between, input damage and output damage? Defender, it's pretty close. It's pretty consistent that the more incoming, the more outgoing. So that seems to be suggestive that defender play is directly related to enemies. That could be another reason why we see a wider spread of the data, where controllers seem to be less affected by that. They could take a whole ton of damage on one mission and barely do any output, and then another mission they're doing a whole bunch of damage and very little input. Could be that black and white, thing. Like, hey, you miss that hold, and all of a sudden you take a big, hit of damage. It could be explained that way. The liability ratio here, we're taking a look at the stats here, the outs versus the ins, that 18, almost 19 versus the 10. Very close, but I think offensively again is the story. The defender offensively is doing statistically better as far as damage output, and we saw that in the individual numbers. So even though the input damages were pretty close, the outputs were, extreme enough that we're seeing a statistically significant difference. So this defender is, I call it liability in the sense that, hey, if you suck at doing damage output, but you're taking a bunch of damage, this number's really low. I mean, they're both pretty good, right? I mean, 9.5 times the damage out for the controller. I mean, that's not like any joke, but the defender did even better, close to 20. So that's a statistically significant difference that we're seeing here. So that is, your overall stats that I wanted to show you all for this character or for this test. So I think it comes down to this then, the question, what's the verdict say about these two characters? I think defensively, they were both really strong. I don't think either one of them was a better supporter, kept their team alive, kept themselves alive, reduced incoming damage. They were pretty neck and neck the whole way. The controller, I will give a nod just because, I was playing her twice as long. So just my own physical, tiredness, should start to show at that point. But that character stood in there strong, even though they did end up with 9 allied defeats. And some of that was in that first mission where people were kind of not sure what to do, and then another chunk of that was in not the mayhem, but the safeguard mission. So she held in there pretty strong. But I got to give the offensive nod to Marquis. I mean, him as a defender, he did more output damage. He was higher on that liability ratio. He had more foe defeats. So he was the winner in this particular matchup just by that virtue, more offensive. Of course, he was built to be more offensive. She was built to be more controlling. So there is, of course, that. They weren't both designed with the same exact, idea, same exact concept there. But that's, the point here of why we're going to go ahead and try to do multiple of these tests with multiple different characters and builds. Because in the accumulation of all that data across all these different characters, that's where I think we're going to see a difference or not. So at this point, DEFCON 5, we had a veritable tie between Emperor Avenger and Ostara for electrical affinity. In DEFCON 4, when we were looking at nature affinity, I had to give the win to the controller. Fey Woad was just, I think, also was more offensive there compared to Screaming Tree, my defender. But here in time manipulation, I think the defender scores a point, tying things up where Marquis is outdoing my controller Bhootakash. Pretty close, but I think I got to give it to him. And that, of course, my friends, is going to take us to our next installment, which is going to be DEFCON 2. This is all the spoiler I'm going to give you. And we're going to get that started getting in next week. We got another pair of characters, Defender and Controller. And we're going to put them head to head and see which of those two is superior. This is coming down to the wire now. We got DEFCON 2 and 1 left. And then I'm going to crunch all the numbers, do my final verdict. All right, well, there you go. That's what I got for you this fine evening. Hopefully there was a lot of juicy statistics in there for you. Didn't melt your brain too much. And we'll see you in the next video when we get into DEFCON 2. Have yourselves a good evening. Pieces.